Good. Well, I'm Roger Payne with James Balog here, and I'm going to be discussing first, I'm going to be interviewing James, and James is going to interview me. I think that's called revenge, if I'm not mistaken. James, my first question is, I know that we're going to be seeing your film Chasing Ice tonight between 7 and 8:30 in the ballroom. And tell us what motivated you to make it in the first place and how it relates to the ongoing concern with global warming and climate change.
Well, I've been a professional environmental photographer for 30 years. I've been a mountaineer for 40 years, and I was trained in the earth sciences about 40 years ago also. And this is an assemblage of everything that I've seen and learned in a way. But essentially, in the course of a National Geographic assignment in 2006, I discovered that the glaciers, well, I didn't discover it, but I learned, it was revealed to me that the glaciers were retreating at an unbelievable pace in much of the Arctic and alpine areas of the world. So I decided that what we should do was to create a project called the Extreme Ice Survey. And kind of the heart of the project is to put time-lapse cameras out at a lot of different sites where glaciers are retreating around the world. We currently, as we sit here today, we have 31 cameras out photographing every half hour, and they're watching the landscape change in places like Iceland and Greenland and Montana and Canada and Alaska. And you know what, at first blush you say to yourself, why do we want to watch ice melt? Well, when you see what's happening, it's kind of mind-boggling, because this is actually the three-dimensional manifestation of climate change. It's these glacial landscapes are the place where you can see and touch and hear and feel climate change in action. So that's what's motivated the project, and that's what makes the film so, unbelievable sometimes. Even for me, when I see it on the screen, I'm kind of shocked at what we have.
There's another, of course, three-dimensional manifestation which is going much slowly, which is sea level rise.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about, what that is affecting and where it's going on most and so on?
Well, as I said, climate change is real, and it's happening in practical terms in a lot of different places. But one of the places where you can see it also is, in fact, in sea level rise. And that ocean out there, on average, around the world, is rising at about 1.25 inches every 10 years. That's about a foot. At the current rate of the past 20 years, that's about a foot in 100 years, minimum, okay? And that's if everything stays exactly as it is. Now, before I tell you what the future holds, I should say that the rate of sea level rise over the past 20 years is double the rate of the sea level rise of the past 100 years. So it's accelerating. So the seas are coming up some more. Okay, the glacial reaction of certain key masses of ice, particularly in Greenland, the Antarctic Peninsula, and West Antarctica, is the big wild card in this story. So if we stay at this rate of about a foot of sea level rise in a century, but we then accelerate the melting of the ice, which is what's happening, we're going to see far, far more than a foot of sea level rise over the next 100 years. And everybody in the ice sciences is pretty well convinced that we're looking at least 1.5 feet to 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. There's really very little doubt about that. And really the big game-changing location is West Antarctica. Yeah. West Antarctica has a series of enormous ice sheets that are sitting the bottom of the ice is sitting far below sea level. They are showing every sign of being destabilized, and they're likely to have some tremendous collapse of ice over the next X number of years. Nobody knows. It could be happening right now, or it may not happen for 10 years or 50 years. But there's a huge amount of ice that could dramatically change the end of century conditions. And by the way, we always talk in terms of what will happen by the end of the century, but none of these processes stop. They just keep on going, and in many cases they keep accelerating. We have definitely been crossing a tipping point in the loss of ice around the world, especially in Greenland. Everything has accelerated in the northern latitudes. The rate of ice discharge from Greenland has doubled in the past 20 years, and so things are happening, and they're happening quickly.
Fascinating. What sort of areas will be in more populated areas than West Antarctica and Greenland will be affected most by this?
Yeah, this is a huge practical issue. It seems, far away when you talk about Greenland and Antarctica, but it affects our shores here. One of the big impacts is in very low-lying, flat-lying, near-ocean areas, for lack of a more graceful term. But the river deltas of the world are places that are essentially incredibly flat. The Mississippi Delta, the Niger Delta, the Ganges, lots of big rivers come out at practically dead flat to sea level. They only rise in 100 miles going inland. They only rise a foot or 2 or 3 above sea level. So all of these delta areas are subject to this inundation. And as many of you know, there's huge concentrations of population in these delta areas in Africa, in Asia, and I spent a lot of time in the Mississippi Delta in the course of working on the Gulf oil spill, and I was amazed at how flat that place is. And you just raise sea level a little bit, all of that land goes away. And according to recent calculations, there's about 150 million people who are living in those areas that are 3 feet above sea level or less. And all of those people who are there currently will wind up getting displaced over the next decades and next century.
Well, talking about displacement, what about I would have thought perhaps greater displacement that will occur as a result of melting of ice in the Himalayas and the dependence that farmers, particularly downstream, have of the water that provides?
Yeah, the Himalayan story is a little complicated, and there's a lot of layers to it. And if I had a good map up here, I could do better justice to it than I can just describing it. But the people who depend on water downstream from the Tibetan Plateau, basically on the north side of the Himalaya and down through China, have a great connection with the runoff from the Indo-Tibetan Plateau and the melting of the glaciers there. On the south side of the Himalaya, there's a tremendous water supply that's just created by the monsoons coming up off the Indian Ocean. So you can lose the glaciers on the south side of the Himalaya, and that accounts for maybe about a third of the current water supply. But then it's the question of, do the monsoons stay steady in a changing climate regime? And that's what governs the surface water supply that they'll be drinking from. So there's complex dynamics going on there, and it's hard to drill in on one side or the other and say, this is catastrophic. And it should be noted that around the world, the vast majority of glaciers are retreating, okay? In all the non-Antarctic parts of the world, all the ice is retreating except for in northern Pakistan, in the Karakoram. The big glaciers around K2, the second highest mountain in the world, a couple of them seem to be advancing a bit, and it's because of changes in the westerlies coming across the southwestern part of Asia and in Eastern Europe. So part of South Asia is destabilized by a changing climate. At the moment, another part of South Asia, i.e. Pakistan in Kashmir, gets a little bit of boost in its water supply from a changing climate.
Fascinating. Now, I want to get back to the film a little. What is the more general problem that you feel can be solved with films such as the one that you've made?
Yeah, we have an enormous problem of perception in this world. Every civilization always has these truths that inform its thinking and its behavior in any given time. There are truths that are held to be permanent and immortal at any given moment. I have a slide in a presentation I give, and I roll out a couple of truths of the past. One is that the earth is flat. Another one is that slavery is acceptable. Another one is that child labor is fair and reasonable and morally acceptable. Another one is that women should not be allowed to vote. These were truths that entire societies and civilizations ran on for many, many years during various phases. And where we've got a problem right now is accepting a big revolutionary new concept that's just come down the chute in science in the past decade. And that is that humans are the dominant agents of change on the planet today. We are a geologic force that exceeds, in most cases, normal natural processes in reshaping the air, the water, the plants and animals. And with that recognition comes a tremendous responsibility. We've always assumed, you know, we all know about pollution and we know about deforestation and so on, but we all assume that, well, you know, we can stop the ecological insults and stop cutting down trees and the earth will quickly and spontaneously revert to what it used to be without any problem. But this new notion that is permeating the earth sciences right now and the biological sciences as well is that no, we are altering things on a one-way course for a very, very, very long time. And with that recognition of that kind of impact and that scale of impact, we have responsibility, which most of us don't like to assume, but we also have great opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity for industrial enterprise, as we all know, green tech and so forth, but there's a lot of other layers to it as well. But we're kind of, to a large extent, in charge of this. We're creating the problems, and we also can create the solutions. I think I drifted off your question,
No,
but
that's all
we're
right.
in
No,
the same ballpark.
It's the same ballpark.
Oh, so let me ask, as long as I've got a whole room full of erudite people, how many of you have heard the word Anthropocene? Has anybody heard the word Anthropocene? Good, all right. You've all heard of the term Pleistocene, which means ice ages, and that's the era of geologic time when the ice ages were creeping down through Canada and Scandinavia. And then following that, there was an era called the Holocene. The new term that science has given to our era of time is the Anthropocene. It's an awful word that only a scientist could love. It's like an impossible word from a marketing standpoint, but Anthropocene, Anthropocene, okay? And the notion is that Homo sapiens, us, is the dominant agent shaping the world as we know it, and that we will leave layers of rock behind us that will be a sedimentary record of how we are changing the landscape today. So that's the idea that was coined in 2000 by a famous Dutch Nobel Prize winning chemist, Paul Crutzen. And the Anthropocene has become a big new framing concept. That's what I was talking about a revolutionary new understanding. That's in the process of overturning our understanding of natural sciences right now.
Wonderful. And since we're talking about, and I'll be talking about it too in a few minutes, but we're talking about change and change of deeply felt things and on a massive scale, else utter catastrophe, what do you think, how can a film best help? What are the limits in that a film has that can help it or not help this
Thank
situation?
you. You're bringing me back around to the other question. I think we've got a profound problem with telling stories. We are operating within a perceptual system, a conceptual system, a mythic system that informs our thinking, our behavior, our lifestyles, our psychology. And a lot of these stories and mythologies are connected to things that don't apply anymore. So when we make films, when we make books, when we do creative art projects, when a Terry Tempest Williams writes an amazing new essay about something, it's part of the process of the human race reshaping the stories that need to help guide us. Science is incredibly important, obviously, but science only touches certain kinds of people in certain parts of the human psyche, whereas art can touch other parts of the human psyche. In fact, in this project that is the subject of tonight's film, the Extreme Ice Survey, we didn't set out to do it this way, but we realized over time that what gives the pictures their resonance is a combination of art and science together. We're fusing, in essence, the two halves of the human psyche, and we can use that to educate and reshape the culture. And we push this material out through schools, through universities, through presentations like this, through all the different mediums that we have access to, whether it's books or films or magazines or internet or radio shows or whatever. And hopefully, this fusion of art and science, right brain, left brain, intuitive and rational thinking, all of that can come together and redirect how we function as human beings.
I really resonate to that because my wife is a Shakespearean actress from the Royal Shakespeare Company, and she and I do a piece together which is called Sea Change, and I do science and she does a poem, and then I do science and she does a poem. And yes, I'm up there and I say stuff and people hear it, but the real force of this is her. And her delivery of these poems is just extraordinary. And what it does, it turns out, is it seems to open the other side of people's brains in such a way, their artistic sides. And now they start listening to science in a way that they don't otherwise do. And I personally feel, I guess, that, I don't know how you would respond to this, but that the great missing step so far, the unexercised step, the one that needs greater development, is in fact the artistic side of changing what's happening to the world, not just the scientific facts, although I am incredibly, I would say, grateful for them.
Yeah, I go to lots and lots of conferences, whether they're science or engineering or academic or environmental and outreach and so on. And the thing I really was struck by in the beginning of this whole process is that we don't really have a serious problem of economic solutions to climate change or technological solutions or policy solutions. I mean, there's challenges and there's problems there, but we understand how to deal with them within those frames. There are just oceans and oceans of papers that have been written and plans that have been developed about how to redo policy in Washington or at the global level or whatever. And again, the challenges are not trivial. I don't want to understate them, but they are workable, and a lot of smart people have come up with a lot of good solutions. I mean, we saw this fantastic thing last night from Craig Venter and his group, and the possibility of fuels coming from algae. I mean, that's incredible. But where we have a problem is with perception. Perception has been the missing leg of civilization's stool on this. You know, that if we've got economic solutions, technological solutions, and policy solutions, that's how we've been tackling this for the most part. What we've been missing is perceptual change, perceptual solutions that can help create the need and the motivation and the understanding that this is something that we need to work with. So there's a bunch of people in the room here, Louis back there, and I think Chris Payne is back here somewhere. We're all working on the storytelling with our own vocabulary, our own perspective. And Chris Jordan back there in the corner, you'll hear more from all of us later on today and tomorrow morning, telling different kinds of stories that help to reshape how we think about climate change and humanity's position on the Earth and how we interface with the Earth. Right. So now, your turn, my friend. As many of you know, Roger did some extraordinary, groundbreaking research in understanding of how cetaceans, whales, and dolphins communicate. And this, you know, speaking of storytelling and understanding humanity's place on the planet and how we interact with nature, your work was one of the most critical points of intellectual contact for many, many people, as well as aesthetic and an emotional contact, to understand that there are these huge communities of other organisms out there talking to each other, just as we're talking to each other today. This is not a unique process. Chimpanzees do it, whales do it, dolphins do it, whatever. So you had a huge hand in altering our civilization's perception of the natural world around us. What are you excited about now? What are you working on now that will that continues to shift that story and alter perception?
Well, I've gotten into what I think is the greater threat to whales than just whaling. Whaling is, just to quickly state it, is totally, the control of whaling is totally out of the hands of anybody except the whalers. The whalers have won absolutely everything. Yes, there's a moratorium. They simply ignore it. They ignore it on the basis of various technicalities. But there is another thing that makes whaling into a lesser overall threat to the lives of whales, and that's pollution. And that comes from the fact that the ocean is downhill from everything on land, so that means that anything that can be moved by the wind or by the water ends up in the sea. And when it ends up in the sea, it ends up in the food chains of the sea, and then you get compounds like organohalogens, an organic molecule attached to one of the halogens, usually chlorine or bromine. And these substances are so extraordinarily insoluble in water, but so very soluble in fats, that they go into fats, the fat droplet usually of a diatom in the water, and then they get into plankton, and then from plankton into tiny fish, and then bigger fish, and eventually, if you're talking about sperm whales, into something big enough for a sperm whale to catch and eat. And so I gave this example, I think, last time I was talking here, but I think it helps to get the idea across quickly. If you get about a 10 times amplification of the amount of, it takes about 10 times as much weight of food to produce the same weight of organism, and that means that you get about a 10 times increase in the contamination concentrations in an animal as that lives at a higher and higher step of each food chain. Each food chain is 10 times. So if you have a swordfish, for example, many of which live at the 6th level of a food chain, how many tons or how many pounds of plankton does it take to produce 1 pound of swordfish? So if you have a pound of swordfish sitting on your plate, and the answer is it takes 10 to the 6th pounds, which is 1 million pounds, which is 500 tons. So not to make the whole fish, just the 1 pound that you're about to eat that you've cooked and it's sitting on your plate. Now that 1 pound, that 500 tons rather, of diatoms or algae or the phytoplankton is equal to 50 10-ton truckloads, all filled to the top and dripping down their sides, and they're all parked in a row. That takes about 18 blocks. And now you tie your liver to the end of that 18 blocks and you detoxify all 50 10-ton truckloads, and that's what you do when you eat a pound, not just of a swordfish that lived at the 6th level of a food chain, but of any fish that lives at the 6th level of a food chain, whether it be a marlin or a shark or even things like bass, striped bass or bluefish and so on. So that's a real problem, and that accumulation in the case of mammals can also be passed on, because it lasts so long in the body, to the next generation in the milk, because it's fat soluble, so it's passed on in the milk of the mother to the babes, her babes. And so that tenderest of all mammalian acts, a mother nursing her baby, what the mother is actually doing is pouring her lifetime's accumulation of toxic substances into her baby. And that adds up from generation to generation. And the result, I think, in the case of most whale species is extinction. I don't see any way around it. In the case of human beings, we can avoid that bullet by feeding formula to our children, to our infants. But in the case of whales, that's obviously not an option. So I thought, all right, well, how polluted are whales and how polluted is the ocean? And I looked around to try to find it, and there were various isolated studies, most of them done along just the edges of the oceans, but nothing that would give an idea of the whole ocean. So I gave my institute, Ocean Alliance, which had about the job of going around the world and measuring those background levels. We took a 5.5-year trip. We got samples from every ocean of the world. We got samples from just about 1,000 sperm whales. And these samples we then analyzed, or John Wise of the University of Southern Maine analyzed for their contaminants. We looked for a whole suite of what are called endocrine disrupting compounds or chemicals, and these are usually things like organohalogens, which interfere with things like the immune system and development and growth, because they interfere with the endocrine system, with the hormones of your body and the bodies of whales. And we also found toxic metals. That was the real surprise. We looked at both toxic and non-toxic metals, all of them, and their concentrations in these samples from all the oceans of the world. And this showed us a total shock that nobody had expected. Everybody knew about mercury, oh yes, sure, and there's lots of that, and plenty of lead, those things, yes. But nickel, well, there was a bit known about that, but basically everybody had pretty much ignored chromium. And we found in sperm whales as far from big agriculture and big industrial plants, we got concentrations of chromium which were as high as those found in workers who had been for 20 years in plants and had died of lung cancer, which they had gotten presumably from that exposure. So that's a real problem. Where does it come from? We have no idea. And we have a theory that it may be inhaled because it doesn't come through the food chain very readily. So that basis gave us a chance to look immediately at the BP oil spill the summer that it occurred. And that was, we took a 90-day expedition then, one last year, we're doing another one this year, and then 2 years beyond this. And we're looking for evidence of what actually happened in the way of poisoning from not just the oil in the spill, but obviously of the dispersants. And so that's what's taken most of my time now away from things like whale songs and listening to whales across oceans and so on. And that work has, that's having shocking results. Again, we're finding extremely high concentrations of nickel and chromium in sperm whales that are in the Gulf of Mexico. And John Wise, who was running these expeditions, the fellow from the University of Southern Maine, the toxicologist, is now finding, his preliminary results are high concentrations of nickel, high concentrations of chromium also in these whales. And he's working as well in another fascinating way, which he's looking at the mechanism by which these animals are affected. We have installed on our boat, I think it's the only boat in the world that has a full cell culture laboratory on board, and he is trying to culture the cells, the samples that he gets from sperm whales. He's incredibly successful at this. They got 88 cell culture lines growing from sperm whales and 2 other species last summer, and I expect they'll add about that same number this year. The federal government is simply either lying, or I think they have to be lying, because the people involved, I know one of them very well. I've known her for years. She's much too smart to say what she's otherwise saying, and that is that the problem basically is over. I mean, those bacteria, they just did their job, and so did the evaporation into the air, and the oil's all gone, and so forth, which is total nonsense. There, first of all, is no evidence whatever from anybody that would say whether that is true or isn't true. It just isn't known, and therefore to state that it's all taken place is it's not being honest. It's what it amounts to. We have terrible trouble finding funding for this because even though BP would love to give us funds, well, they do have this problem that they control publication, and you have to approve everything through them. And the government would love to give us funding too, but they have this criminal charge against BP, and until that case is settled, something I don't think that my life expectancy will ever let me see, until that is settled, why, you can't publish anything at all. So what it amounts to is basically a gag order on anybody who's really studying this. So we have taken all the funding that we've gotten from individuals or from foundations, which would make it possible for us to say what we're finding out, which is very important. Sorry, a long answer. Too long.
No, that's good. Well, we were talking the other day about ocean pollution, and you characterize ocean pollution as being the world's greatest health threat. Why?
About 1 billion people use as their primary source of animal protein, not protein, animal protein, fish or food from the sea. These people are therefore being exposed to the same sorts of concentrations that we're seeing in whales, because whales and people eat at about the same levels of food chains. So my feeling is, if you end up eating fish which are too polluted to be eaten safely, and that is already admitted by the tuna industry for pregnant women, they're fighting it tooth and nail, as every industry seems to fight this kind of thing. But if that is the case, then what is happening, the kindest thing you can say about it, is that these contaminants in the ocean are shortening lives of 1 billion people, or some of those billion people. Now, the worst shortening of life that I'm aware of from a disease took place, well, not the worst, but one of the best known and worst would be the plague, and it didn't come near that number. So this problem is on no radar of any country, as far as I know. Nobody's paying any attention to it, doing anything about it, but I think it is probably the most serious public health threat out there, because it's sure to affect 1 billion people.
Are we at the moment when we should do some questions, do you think?
Yeah.
Do you have some more you want to
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we've only got a few minutes left, and maybe we should take any questions from the audience, anything that arises. Lou? Is that Lou back there? Or
It is
Peter?
Lou, yeah.
Roger, I'm curious, there are regulations with the food FDA on certain fish or the amount of fish. Beg your pardon?
Lou, can you use the microphone, please?
Roger, there are certain statistical information from the Food and Drug Administration for individuals, the amount of fish that a pregnant woman should consume for brain development and things like that. Am I hearing you say that you could disagree with all those findings?
I think those findings tend to have to do more with nutrition than they do with contaminants in the food. And certainly none of them took into account any of the work that we had done because they came out before we published our results 2 years ago. But that sort of effort to get contaminant analysis added to that sort of recommendation has so far proved to be wrong, fruitless. And also the EPA, which is responsible for protecting the health of the people of this country at least from this sort of problem, has used, as far as I can see, pretty much every trick in the book to avoid it. So, and some of them pretty dreadful. We're also studying, for example, the results we're getting now from the Gulf of Mexico and the results that we had from the earlier study going all the way around the world. We're getting background levels of PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers. These are flame retardants. In America, the children have the highest concentrations of any children in the world of flame retardants. When you sleep on a pillow which has been treated with flame retardants, in other words, any foam pillow that you put your head on, you spend 8 hours of your day inhaling at close range the off-gassing of that pillow of these PBDEs, and no wonder you end up with high concentrations of them in your body. And what has happened is that flame retardants new ones have come out and new efforts have been made, but now there's a study which just came out which turns out that the whole effort to insist on flame retardants in the United States came from a secret effort by the cigarette companies who were being asked to create a fire-safe cigarette, a cigarette which would go out if you weren't puffing on it, so as to reduce fires in houses. And instead of doing that, because that was going to cost them money and be hard to do, what they did instead, in secret, was they mobilized the fire marshals of states all around the country who probably acted in perfectly good faith, not realizing that this was, in fact, an alternative for the cigarette companies to prevent them from spending the money which they would otherwise have to spend on that kind of, on this creation. So no fire-safe cigarette was produced. So instead of stopping the igniting of the material, you blame the material that got ignited, and that's what has happened. And it's just an article in the Times came out about that recently, based on an article that was in the Chicago Tribune, I think.
So if you had a friend who was a female and she was pregnant, what type of fish, which species of fish would you recommend that individual consume?
The only fish that my wife and I eat are tilapia, which is a vegetarian fish, just because it feeds low enough on the food chain so that I feel more comfortable in doing it. Some forms of salmon are probably fairly safe, but I've become pretty much a vegetarian as a result of this work, I'm afraid.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe?
Yeah.
Chris?
James, as always, I'm really moved by your discussion of story and perception and the need for a sort of shift of consciousness in the world. And one of the things that I wrestle with in my work is the relationship between the individual and the collective. In other words, we have this giant collective story, this kind of comprehensive catastrophe that we're all contributing to, and yet and it requires some kind of radical action on the part of all of us. And yet, each one of us, as 1 out of 7 billion people, can can make a persuasive internal argument, well, I'm too small to make a difference. My company's too small to make a difference. My whole country is even too small to make a difference. And so how do we bridge the gap where we begin to make like collective decisions to address these issues? And how does that become part of the story?
Yeah, it's the ultimate question, a fantastic question, and actually, Chris, in the interest of time, I think I'll punt that answer to the Q&A after the film tonight, because that's really one of the central questions that always comes out of the film. But it's critical, and this conflict between doing something as an individual or not, and doing something as societal increments or not, is a huge, huge problem, and it's kind of where we are paralyzed right now. So perhaps we'll have some dialogue about that tonight after the film.
Thank you all
Thanks so much.
very much.